Welcome everybody to the Grand Reckoning. We have Scott Horton today on Ukraine. I thought who better than the guy who literally wrote the book. He's also the director of the Scott Horton Academy of Foreign Policy and Freedom. That's a new thing that he's doing. I personally recommend this for homeschooling because he has taught me nearly everything I know about foreign policy. So we had you on because I think that the Ukraine argument is talked about in either like a pro-Ukraine or a pro-Russian point of view. And what I really enjoy about what you kind of come at it from is not necessarily there's any issue with per se the Ukrainians looking for their own self-determination, but basically it's not just a construct from the Russian side. There is a lot of part to play from the West as well. Let's get into how this kind of got to be where we are today. I like your explanation of basically how the Cold War never exactly ended. So if you want to kind of go in and explain that, Scott, I'd really appreciate it.
Sure. Well, to try to sum it up, essentially that's right. When the Soviet Union fell apart, the idea that was floated repeatedly was that we were erasing all the dividing lines in Europe, that we would bring the Soviet Union and then later just the Russian Federation after the USSR finally fell, and we'd bring them into a common security arrangement with the United States and the rest of Western Europe together. As they put it, they would make NATO a political organization, something like the EU plus America. But then NATO would be replaced by then the original proposal was the CSCE, now known as the OSCE, which had existed since 75 in the Helsinki Agreement of 75, in which all the Eastern European nations and Russia were already members of. So the thing is, they never meant that. And the plan always was not only to keep America in NATO, to keep America dominant in Germany and prevent an independent Germany from having its own foreign policy to the contrary of American and British interests, but to expand the NATO alliance further into Eastern Europe at the earliest opportunity in order to just expand American hegemony and to hem in the Russians. So what's important about all this is that the people who were in favor of the policy agreed with the people who were opposed to it. That, yeah, this really could cause a negative reaction from the Russians. The people who were opposed to it said, why in the hell would we do anything that's going to cause a negative reaction from the people who just overthrew the communists for us? And we're going to pick a fight with them. Why would our relationship with Warsaw or Tallinn be more important than our relationship with Moscow? And then on the other side of the argument was, yes, this could provoke a bad reaction from Russia, but screw them. What the hell are they going to do about it? Nothing. Because we are the superpower now, and they are no longer a superpower. And so they're not in any position to stop us, so we can do what we want. Screw them. And that was the policy that they pursued through Bill Clinton, W. Bush, and Obama, and into Trump. And included with this was the so-called color-coded revolutions, where these are essentially coups d'etat dressed up as popular revolutions, but sponsored by foreign powers to overthrow anyone who's very friendly to Russia in their near abroad or try to. And also the tearing up of the anti-ballistic missile treaty and the stationing of military forces in Eastern Europe, as Bill Clinton promised he would never do when he started expanding NATO in the 90s, went ahead and did that anyway. And they put the anti-ballistic missile stations in Romania and Poland and the radars in the Czech Republic and have permanent bases in Romania and in Lithuania. So this culminated then in Bush in 08 promising to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO, which quickly led to a war in Georgia, which the Georgians started trying to solidify their disputed borders so that they could join the alliance. And then this ongoing process in Ukraine of what they called interoperability, essentially making Ukraine a de facto member of NATO. And that included the overthrow of their government for the second time in 10 years in 2014. And essentially, again, making them a de facto member of NATO while supporting Kiev's side of the civil war that broke out after the coup of 14 and the loss of Crimea, and then the dispute over sovereignty in the east of the country. So in the lead up to the fuller scale invasion, the vast increase in the conflict by Russia in 2022, you had these on the three, I guess, major ongoing disputes, three or four ongoing problems that needed to be addressed were one, the ongoing civil war in the East, which was supposed to have been solved by a peace deal back in 2015, which was never really implemented by Kiev. Then you had um, the ongoing expansion of just the overall kind of standardization of the Ukrainian military with NATO forces, so that in the event of a real war between NATO and the Russian Federation, theirs would be just another auxiliary army along with Germany and Poland and Lithuania and everybody else. Just that even if we don't have a Article 5 war guarantee to them yet, we still would use their military as just another auxiliary army in the NATO army against Russia, if that ever came to pass. And then there's the threat of the installation of these anti-ballistic missile systems, just as they put in Romania and Poland, what's called Aegis onshore. That's the most sophisticated radar and anti-missile system on Navy ships. But the thing is about the missile launchers that host the Sparrow anti-ballistic missiles is that those launchers can also host Tomahawk cruise missiles. And so, as Putin put it repeatedly, I think quite seriously, and his men did too for many years, there's a real threat here that the purpose of installing these anti-ballistic missile systems was essentially as a ruse for placing these launchers into far eastern Poland so as to help achieve a first strike capability against Russia. And here he said in his speech, for example, in one of his many statements about this, when he declared war, that if America were to install these anti-missile systems or these launchers and put Tomahawk cruise missiles in them, that they could reach Moscow in 10 minutes. And that this is essentially a strategic threat that he's not willing to tolerate, and he's going to draw the line now. As I write in the book, and as I've said repeatedly in interviews, I do not believe that he had no choice but to invade. As I've tried to put it, I don't know if people like this metaphor because it's just an analogy and what are you going to do? But like, I think to me, the equivalent is sort of like America put the Russians back to the wall and then they decided to go ahead and stab us, right? Like that was our friend that we put in between us. So it was Putin's back all the way in a corner. We had absolutely no choice but to fight. No. But if you put a tough guy's back all the way to a wall, he might not wait until you have him in a corner. That's kind of how fist fights go. People really know about that. So that was the situation here. There was nothing that changed on February the 21st to the 22nd that meant that he absolutely had to go now. But he had talked himself into the position that the status quo here is absolutely untenable. And it absolutely was a proven fact by the end of February, I guess he would argue, that the Americans would not deal in good faith. Joe Biden had every opportunity to negotiate a treaty to figure this out. The deal that Putin put forward in December of 21 was not perfect. And in a situation like this, no one would have expected the Americans to simply sign on the dotted line at the bottom. However, that treaty was not just some poison pill, ridiculous offer that was made to be rejected with impossible demands. Like, say, for example, America's supposed peace accord in 1999 before the Serbian War, which had impossible demands that we get to occupy every square inch of Serbia, including the presidential palace and all these things, right? Which obviously was made to be rejected. This wasn't that. And I talked to experts like Chas Freeman, who's a former, longtime diplomat, but also I have the sources in the book where Biden White House officials admitted to the New York Times and the Washington Post that these were credible proposals, realistic proposals, negotiable deals if they were to sit down and negotiate them. And they weren't willing to do that. And that was based on, and you'll probably remember this if you go back 3 years, that they had this slogan, essentially, right? This jargon, which they claimed to be this high holy principle of the open door policy. I said that any country that wants to join NATO can join NATO if the NATO member states decide, but that no third party's interests will ever be taken into account and whether we're going to do that or not. And the way that they framed that was, okay, does anyone sitting around the table agree that Vladimir Putin should get to have veto power and decide who's allowed to join NATO or not? And nobody raises their hand and says that, yes, we all think that it's up to Vladimir Putin to decide who's allowed to join our alliance. And so they go, okay, therefore that's it. No matter what the Russians' concerns are and how legitimate they might be or might not be, not the Russians, not anyone else is ever going to tell us that we can't expand our military alliance because of the threat that they consider it would pose to their security. We said it once, we said it 100 times, and if we said it 100 times, we said it 1,000 times. NATO is a defensive alliance, and you don't have anything to worry about, right? And it's the sacred, undeniable right of all nation states to join any military alliance they choose, unless they're Cuba or the Solomon Islands or any other country that, is acting contrary to American goals, you understand. But otherwise, it's this sacred principle. And this was very apparent at the start of the war, right before it and right after it began, when the kind of knee-jerk reaction on the part of all rational adults on the planet Earth was, well, aren't we sending the diplomats to Geneva to solve this problem immediately? We can't have a hot, violent conflict on Russia's border, just hundreds of miles away from Moscow. We got to solve this right now. And for example, the great journalist Ryan Grimm asked the State Department spokesman, Ned Price, well, Ned, so what are we doing to try to get an end to the fighting? Are we going to negotiate? Are we going to Geneva? What are we doing here? And Ned says, there are larger principles at stake in this conflict, such as the sacred right of a nation to direct its gaze in whichever direction that it wishes to. Huh? In other words, they were not going to negotiate in good faith to prevent this war. And we know why. Was one, they'd hung their hat on that for as far as that goes. But I think that mostly was a pretext too, because what they had decided was that if the Russians invaded, they would make it very difficult for the Russians and they would deliver upon them a strategic defeat. Just like if you've ever seen Rambo 3, just like when Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan and George Bush Sr. helped Rambo and Osama bin Laden and the Afghan Mujahideen bog down and weaken the Soviet Union in its last decade on this planet in the and
Yeah, that's
culminating in
actually
their
a point I
withdrawal
was
in
going to get to.
1989, just as the wall was coming down and the beginning of the final end and the unraveling of the Soviet Union began. Boy, as they told the New York Times, I swear you could find this in the New York Times, Admiral Stavridis, who would have been Hillary Clinton's Secretary of Defense, said, after our 25 years of terror war, we have to admit, we really don't know anything about how to fight a counterinsurgency. Or sorry, we don't know how to fight an insurgency, but we sure know how to back one. And so, right, we couldn't defeat the Taliban, but we could help Al Qaeda create the caliphate, right? And so that's what we're going to do in Ukraine. Is we're going to go ahead and let the Russians invade, and then we're going to arm up the Ukrainians as much as we can. And even if the Russians win, we're going to make them win the long and the hard way and inflict on them essentially a Pyrrhic victory. I don't think they ever believed they could really help Ukraine turn the tide in the war. If you're familiar with a Pyrrhic victory, General Pyrrhus, the Roman general, said one more victory like this and we're doomed, right? Because of the cost of his victory was so high. And as I say in the book, I think that worked, actually. I think the Russians are winning the war. They're going to win the war on their terms, but at an inordinate cost. And not just in the price of lives and rubles, but also in the new strategic situation that they'll be leaving themselves in with a new rump Ukraine run by permanent enemies that they're going to have to deal with from now on. So I really think, as I think Talleyrand said about, I forgot which thing Napoleon Bonaparte had done, or was it the royal family, where he says it's worse than a crime, it was a mistake. And I think that's the same thing here, where it was really the wrong thing to do, but also it was really the wrong thing to do from their own point of view.
All right, so I'd like to ask what you think about a couple of things.
Sure.
I basically also first, pleasure to have you on the show. I basically agree with your analysis on American policy, but I think it's very incomplete. I think that there's a couple of very important elements missing here. The first is Well, there's three elements missing here. The first is a sort of division into the timeline, right? The United States had all the power in the 90s. But once you get into the 2000s, the Russians are just as active as the Americans in subverting Ukraine, and also have put more attention and more energy into it, especially, people like Yanukovych and that kind of subversion of Ukrainian democracy,
I
not
think
to
that's
mention, of
fully
course.
inaccurate.
Well, let me finish and then respond.
Yeah.
In 20, then you have the invasion in 2014. Obviously, that I'd like you to address is the actual agency of Ukrainians. Like yourself, I just saw. I'm married to a Ukrainian woman, so I have this in my house every day. And her family, and she was there at the Maidan in 2014, demonstrating. And her family are very passionately opposed to the Russian invasion. Very much welcome American aid. I think that a lot of the American intervention is much more in tune with what Ukrainians as a whole want. And then we have a third thing, which is that if we look at this as a proxy war, which it is, proxy wars are natural. That's what happens in these kinds of buffer states like Ukraine. But I think we need to, at some point, put a red line of you don't go beyond this behavior. And that behavior is full-on invasions. And that's what Russia did. And if we're anti-war, I think that we need to really put the blame on the country that ultimately invaded. So I agree with everything you're saying about the United States, but I'd like to hear you address these other points,
Sure.
these other elements.
Okay, well, first of all, while it's true that Yushchenko was America's guy in the Orange Revolution of 2004, it's not true that Yanukovych was Russia's guy. And that's a vast oversimplification. And in fact, he was from the Eastern parties, but the Eastern oligarchs that backed him, people like Dmitry Firtash, he's a major donor and friend of the Clintons. And in fact, those Eastern Ukrainian oligarchs were sick and tired of being under the thumb of the Russians and wanted to move west. And that was why they supported Yanukovych. And a real great source for this, by the way, you'll be fascinated to see, is an interview with Paul Manafort by Patrick Bet-David. And Paul Manafort, you'll remember, was falsely accused of being Donald Trump's handler for Vladimir Putin during Russiagate in the Steele dossier. And so Manafort gave this interview with Patrick Bet-David where he explains his relationship with Yanukovych. Was he was brought in and helped Yanukovych to win the election of 2010, which he did handily and absolutely crushed the victors of the Orange Revolution, which Yushchenko got 5% in the first round there. And they helped him win, and the whole point was to move Ukraine west. And the first thing that Yanukovych did was go to Brussels, not to Moscow. And if you look at the run-up to the Maidan Revolution of 2013-14, what actually happened there was that Yanukovych was trying to join the EU. He was making that deal as an association agreement with the EU, and he had shouted down his entire cabinet, and he was dragging his government, again, an Eastern-led party. It was considered necessary that it was an Eastern-led party that was dragging the rest of the country in to join the EU. But what happened was, and this is according to George Soros and Henry Kissinger both, that it was Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, just drove way too hard of a bargain with Ukraine. They were going to get minimal loans, not even enough to roll over their debt from last year, while having to install a strict austerity regime of cutting back all pensions and all subsidies and all of this stuff. Well, at the same time, Putin was also playing hardball and saying, if you do, and there were mixed signals on this, by the way, but we'll just take the worst interpretation here. If you do a deal with them, you're not going to have a deal with me anymore, but I'll give you a $15 billion loan and I'll write off your bad debts and we'll make a whole new deal on the gas pipeline transit fees. And he just made him a way sweeter deal. And again, it was Soros and Kissinger who both blamed Merkel for ruining that deal. And then when he said, okay, well, look, I can't go along with this, and officially postponed signing the deal, that was when a bunch of Western agents launched the Maidan Revolution. And the whole thing was started by a guy named Mustafa Naim, who worked directly for George Soros at Hamdradsky TV. And it was him and all of his people on at least tens, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars of Western, American especially, and other Western money to support that entire Maidan revolution. So you can say, oh, they have agency. Okay, well, if you had, say, the Occupy movement in New York City in the aftermath of the bank bailouts in 2009 and 10, What if the Chinese have been pouring tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars into that encampment and shipping in leftists from all around the country to come and occupy New York? And this giant thing is sponsored by foreign power. You would not say, well, look, man, those hippies have their own opinion and everything. You would say what's happened here is these people have all been suborned and are now sock puppets. They are foreign agents. And maybe they're acting because they're very upset that an end to progress toward negotiation to join the EU means that they're going to be back under the thumb of the Russians, and they really don't want that. Well, that's fine and all. But to say that, as you put it, well, kind of the feeling and the opinion of the whole of the Ukrainians, I think were your words there, or the Ukrainians
majority.
in general, yeah, there's no such thing as that, right? This is a country that's severely divided politically, ethnically, and culturally speaking. And you had, particularly from the time of the Orange Revolution in 2004, a massive culture war by the Ukrainian nationalists from Lviv and the far western provinces in order to force new Ukrainian nationalism on the people of the East, who were, in fact, harshly rejecting it, since so many of the people of the East are ethnic and culturally Russian, and Russian speakers don't even speak Ukrainian at all, etc. So that was the part of the nature of that whole conflict there. And then when they overthrew Yanukovych, that was actually not literally the Americans that overthrew him. It was just that they had supported the giant carnival in the street for 2.5 months leading up to the thing. And then at the end of it all, they forced him to accept an agreement where he would pull his police forces back. And at that point, the Nazis announced that they were not going to go along with any compromise, and that if the president didn't leave town by 10 a.m. the next morning, they were going to kill him. And that was a guy named Parasyuk, who was already admitted that he was the leader of the snipers from the music conservatory that helped to escalate the entire crisis beginning on the 18th. And that guy Parasyuk, even the New York Times covered this, Parasyuk got up on the stage, grabbed the microphone from Tanny Bach, who another Nazi from the Svoboda party, and said, we don't accept any compromise. We don't accept any compromise where the tyrant stays. He goes, or I'll kill him myself at 10 a.m. tomorrow. And then the next morning, all the Nazis went and seized all the government buildings and ran the president out of town in what the Germans call a street putsch, a completely illegal coup. And this is what the Americans call the triumph of democracy, where a democratically elected leader is run out of town by a bunch of Nazi street toughs, but they're on the side of the West. And so that's the democratic will of the people somehow being expressed. When the guy had agreed to early elections and everything. And then now, as far as the Russian invasion, there's no Russian invasion. I mean, what happened was they essentially did a coup de main, if you want to call it that, on the Crimean Peninsula, which had a complicated history, but had been a part of the Russian Empire since the 1780s, since 1783, the same year America made our peace with Britain to end the Revolutionary War. 4 years before our Constitution was ratified was when the Russians stole it from the Turks. And then it was a supermajority Russian population. It was only given to Ukraine, not in the Soviet Commie Revolution of 1917 or anywhere around then, but in 1954, when Khrushchev did it as a favor to the Ukrainian Communist Party so that they would support his rise to power after Stalin died, and to celebrate the 300 years of Ukrainian and Russian co-nationhood and whatever, as they were doing at that time. So this is an edict of the General Secretary of the Communist Party from 1954, not sacred writ. And in fact, it was in direct reaction to the American illegal coup, which the Budapest Memorandum, the Russians promised never to change sovereignty in Ukraine anywhere, but America also promised, just like in the Helsinki Accord and in the UN Charter and everything else, not to intervene in Ukraine's internal politics, which of course is exactly what they had done severely. And so the Russians, what they did was they already had a naval base at Sevastopol. And so the Marines and the sailors just went outside and stood on the street corners. There were no battles. 4 people were killed. 2 Russian soldiers, 1 Ukrainian soldier, and 1 cop, I think, were killed in the entire thing. And then they, ratified it with elections, which, the minority lost, and that's kind of not fair, but it was the super majority. And it was American polling firms from Germany, but also including Gallup, and did I say American? Western firms from Germany, but also the American firms, Pew and Gallup, also showed that the people of Crimea, those election results were clear, that they did support declaring independence from Ukraine and joining the Russian Federation. Then when you mention invasion, it is a fact that Russian troops intervened in the civil war in the East twice, in August of 14 and in January, February of 15. But the civil war itself was not an invasion. That was a lie. What happened was it was coincidentally planned that all the the Eastern governors and mayors and all that had a giant meeting already scheduled for the 22nd. So just as the government is being overthrown in Kiev, their officially designated representatives are all meeting in their own kind of mini Congress, where they decide that they're going to declare not exactly independence and like secede from Ukraine, but they're declaring sovereignty, and they're refusing to accept the rule of the new completely illegal coup d'etat junta that had just seized power. And while the politicians in Kiev promised peace and negotiations, the Americans came in and insisted that they go to war. And once they started attacking, about half the army, or I don't know exactly, but a huge proportion of the army changed sides and went to the Donbass rebels' side of the war. And so that was where they got all their equipment from, was the army itself split. And then the army that was left refused to fight. And so what'd they do? They brought the Nazis from the revolution and formed the Azov battalion and sent them to be the vanguard of the war, to start the war in March and April of 2014. And when they did that, the first thing they did, of course, was kill civilians and drive people into the rebel camp. Now, on April the 12th and 13th, the CIA director, John Brennan, came to town. And on the 14th, they launched the official anti-terror operation, which was the civil war, including airstrikes and heavy artillery and tanks and massive attacks against the rebels in the East. And there were some Russian agents among them, but hey, let's not deny the agency of the tens of thousands of people who were seizing these government buildings, and with nothing like the Russian financing that the Western side had, if you want to make that comparison, who were refusing to accept the rule of the new illegal national government that has taken over. And they hadn't killed anybody. The most violent thing they had done was seize the National Intelligence SVB headquarters in Donetsk. And then in response to that, Kiev attacked them with airstrikes and heavy artillery and Nazi militias. And that was how the war began. As far as Russian invasion goes, in August of 14, they sent a detachment of troops across that helped push the Ukrainian forces out at, I guess at Slavyansk. And then they had another major defeat at Debaltseve in February of 15. And both of these minor incursions and interventions by the Russians on the side of the rebels were just enough to force the Ukrainians to the table to negotiate for the Minsk I and the Minsk II deal. Meanwhile, when the Donbass so-called rebel leaders asked, first of all, they held a plebiscite where the people voted to declare independence from Kiev. And there are eyeball witnesses, including from the New York Times, who said hundreds of thousands of people came out to vote for independence in that thing. That was not just a Russian sham. That's Keith Gesson in the New York Times wrote about that, or one. And there's others too I cite in the book. But when the leaders of the rebels asked to join the Russian Federation, Putin told them no, and it demanded that they stop waving the Russian flag and said, we'll give you deniable support to essentially keep Kiev out, but we're not going to intervene full scale. And then they refused to intervene full scale for another 7 years. So does that, in any way like acquit their actual sins, where they're making matters worse? They're sending in weapons. They're maybe giving the rebels a harder line to negotiate, where otherwise maybe they would have been more conciliatory toward Kiev or something like that. Like, I don't know. Sure. Every part of whatever they're actually guilty of, they're like, I don't care. You can assign whatever responsibility to them that you want, but there ain't no need to embellish the actual situation. And I already said that I blame them for escalating the war by whatever 10,000% in February of 2022. There was no immediate casus belli, right? He had drawn a line and said, all right, damn it, now my line is drawn. Well, that's his problem. I'm not saying that was justified, but it is absolutely a fact that, well, first of all, that if you go down his litany of claims against the United States, they're all essentially correct. That John McCain and Joe Biden have been driving this truck for the last 30 years and they wrecked it. They suck. And this is what has come of all of that. And secondly, that Biden refused to negotiate in good faith to satisfy Russian concerns here. And so that I don't believe that that means that he had no choice. In fact, I was on an interview recently where the lady was saying, essentially he decided that he couldn't leave this problem to someone else. I'm like, okay, but that's the same thing as admitting he had no immediate cause to spell it for war, right? I mean, you're talking about escalating a war by 10,000%. Better really need to do that. And even if you were a Russian patriot, you would have to say that, like, man, this has cost the Russians a lot. And it used to be, look, why did America have to overthrow the government over there, twice in 10 years? It's because people who were at least, more moderate toward the Russian position kept winning, right? So, but that's never going to happen again now. The Russians have now drawn a line around every last Ukrainian who ever liked them. And so they're going to have nothing but enemies in the new Ukraine, which I think is essentially, if you follow the logic of government programs, I think that they're going to be stuck in war over there for a very long time. Because even after they take what they want east of the river, they're still going to face essentially a Nazi-led junta west of it. And that's not hyperbole, by the way. I've written a couple articles about this recently. My most recent piece at antiwar.com is called Keeping Up with Ukraine's Nazis. And this is not to say that Ukraine's government is riddled with Nazis, but it is to say that their military is. And these guys are legitimate Hitler-loving National Socialists. Their grandfathers served Hitler in the Second World War. Their groups are direct descendants of the OUN-UPA that served the Nazis in the war. And that is their legacy. And they're, they don't have George Washingtons and Nathaniel Greens over there to celebrate as heroes. All they have is a bunch of Hitlerians like Stepan Bandera and Repin Stepovich and all those guys who were helped commit the Holocaust. And so this is the national mythology. They're building their new national military and political culture around. And you have the most prominent of the Nazis in the country have been leading at the front this whole war. The most dangerous of them is Andrei Beletsky, who's a brigadier general, who's in charge of what's now called the 3rd Army Corps. That's the Azov Battalion, has now grown into the 3rd Army Corps, and they have their own chain of command directly to the president and directly to the Westerners in Germany running the war. And they're kind of their own special operations division fighting mostly in the north there. But then Oleg Tannibok, who helped do the overthrow, he's famously on the stage with John McCain in 2014. He and his son are both fighting with the National Guard in the East. Propanenko, I think is how you say his name, is leading the 12th special detachment or whatever in the National Guard. And Yevhen Karas, who was the guy who said, yeah, if it hadn't been for us Nazis, that whole thing would have just been a big gay parade. But we're the ones who, the Westerners like us because we like killing and all that. That guy is the leader of C-14, is also, a leader of the fight in the south of the country. And when the war finally ends, all these guys are going to be war heroes. They're all going to be venerated for all of their great sacrifices against the.
Let me see if I can bridge this
juggernaut
point here. The when we go back, like you mentioned, the Mujahideen is a good example, because if you go back, like, I don't think any of us sitting here would agree that the Soviet Union was a great, country. This isn't what's being argued.
Right.
When we say that it was definitely a mistake to fund these extremists to go and pick a fight with the Soviet Union. And that ended up giving them enough momentum to eventually take out the Twin Towers. Now we're looking at, it's just a fact of the matter. Only extremists are the ones that are picking up guns and going to fight.
Yeah.
It's by default.
Here, let me show you. So in the intervening years, this book is called From the Fires of War. This is by the guys from Bellingcat, who you guys probably are familiar with them, pushing out NATO and MI6 and CIA type propaganda about Syria or Ukraine especially, or whatever. But, and you guys will be familiar with this, right? That there's like a certain kind of left-wing sort of activists and journalists that really gets focused on neo-Nazis, and they can be very dangerous, right? And so, like, for example, Ali Soufan, who is the former FBI agent and bin Ladenite hunter, shifted his focus to white supremacist groups, right? So this book, this came out just when the war broke out in 22. And I joke in my book that the poor guy who published this, he must have been really torn whether to put this out at all. Because by the time the book came out, the narrative at Bellingcat had entirely shifted to 100% anti-Russia, 100% Ukraine is all heroes. But this book is about how there was this massive and burgeoning neo-Nazi movement in Ukraine, the most powerful neo-Nazi movement anywhere in the world, from 2014 through 2022. And it included, I always find this to be funny, and this is true in the World War II era as well, that you have international conferences of national socialists who come from, these far right wingers from all around the world come and have these big meetings together. And you have white supremacists from the United States, from Sweden, from England, from Italy, and from Brazil, and from all over, traveling to Ukraine to fight with the Azov Battalion against the Russians over the course of this war. And this guy is Colborn. This book is by Michael Colborn. And there's another guy whose name, I'm sorry, is on the tip of my tongue, who's also from Bellingcat. This is the kind of thing that the guys at the Daily Beast would write about. If you're very familiar with the Daily Beast, it used to be Newsweek. I mean, Newsweek, that brand name got bought by someone else, but Newsweek became the Daily Beast. And it's like the heart of war party propaganda, right? They're like Hillary Clintonites, always for war, like very center-left hawk types, and the type of people whose politics would lean very pro-Kiev and anti-Russia, right? It's like John McCain's finds himself at home at the Daily Beast, right? And then they write about this too. And their point is, hey guys, these Nazis are really dangerous and we have to be really careful that we're backing a bunch of Nazis. Because after all, like, this is irresponsible, man. This is the fate of an entire nation that we are playing with, right? So in other words, responsible hawks at the Daily Beast are concerned that, man, we should not be doing this. I went over there and I met these guys and they're like, we're not Nazis. And I was like, what's that on your arm? And he was like, well, it's a giant tattoo of a swastika with the eagle on top that says kill all the Jews. But other than that, though, like, yeah, I mean, my political philosophy is National Socialism. And I do think Hitler was really great and all. But otherwise, it's really wrong to call us Nazis. It's quite unfair. And so, in other words, when I cite the Daily Beast and Bellingcat, you understand, like, in legal terms, this is against interest for them to admit that antiwar.com is right, that these guys are really dangerous, that we are backing there for our anti-Russian ends.
Can you
And
tell
it
us a
seems
little
like
bit
with
more about?
Zelensky at the head, you're setting up the backstab, myth.
Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to ask. Can you tell us more about how much political power these individuals have now and how it's manifesting in Ukrainian policy?
Yeah. So right after the coup in 2014, there were 10 major Nazis took positions of power in the government, including the leaders of the national police forces, the leaders of the Azov Battalion, advisors to the commander-in-chief of the military, and all of this stuff right away. Andrei Parubi, who was from the Svoboda Party, that is the Social National Party. Get it? Social Nationalists. A guy on Twitter goes, dude, what's your problem, man? They're the exact opposite of the National Socialists. Parubi, he became the Speaker of the Parliament for like 8 years. And he was only recently assassinated on the street, by the way. They blamed a distraught father of a dead soldier, although then others said that it was the Russians behind it, whatever. He finally got one in the head. Beletsky was in jail during the revolution, but was sprung right after it. And then he was the primary organizer of the Azov Battalion. He went into politics. You'll find a lot of times, including probably at the Daily Beast and other places, whenever people kind of downplay this stuff, they'll say, come on, the Nazis do very poor at the polls. Well, actually, they get like up to 40-something% out west. Watch out, right? In a lot of cases. But also,
what party are you referring to? Like, can you tell us a little bit about this party?
Because that's right, because it's a parliamentary system with a bunch of rotating parties, some of which will come and go overnight. And
Kind
so
of
a
like
lot of
Ben
times
Gvir
what
and
happens is,
Smotrich type situation where they have an outsized amount of power because, the level of threat to the actual coalition.
Right, that's why I'm asking. Yeah, and if you look at their mandates, you have no idea how much power they have because the ruling party in Israel has a lot of people who are just like them. So I'm just kind of wondering how it works.
Yeah. So in this case, yes, you have essentially the parties that are, we are Hitlerians. They don't do very well. But then the Hitlerians just go and join the Fatherland Party, and then they do fine, right? And so it's that kind of thing where, they kind of launder themselves into these larger parties, and they ended up with, quite a few major important players in the Rada, as well as like Troyan was the head of the national police and all this. Now, I don't know of any actual, that far right nationalists in the Zelensky government right now, like in terms of the civilian regime. But these very important players are in the military now,
How
and
does
they're going to
Zelensky
be the war
deal with all
heroes
this?
soon.
As a Jewish man, how does Zelensky deal with all this? What's his relationship with this ideology, with these people?
Well, so it's interesting. I mean, first of all, he was, a sock puppet of an important Jewish oligarch named Kolomoisky. He's an extremely corrupt, extremely wealthy man who had, picked the Western side in the thing.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
And
Yeah.
the previous president, Poroshenko, had turned against Kolomoisky and nationalized his bank at American and IMF insistence because he had ripped them off so badly. And so Kolomoisky had a vendetta against Poroshenko. And so he backed Zelensky against Poroshenko. You might know the story. They made a TV show about him where he's a school teacher who goes viral on YouTube for giving an anti-corruption speech and ends up becoming the president of the country. And then lo and behold, they run him to be the president of the country, and it works. Now, part of what's unique about Zelensky is he's Jewish and he's from Kharkiv. So what that means is he's not an ethnic Ukrainian from out west, but he's also not an ethnic Russian from the east. He can play third man. And also he's from Kharkiv, so he speaks Russian. He didn't speak a lick of Ukrainian when he came in. He spoke only Russian. But he's not from Donetsk, which is further east and where people are much more likely to have family across the border and be much more like closely tied that way. So in other words, he made for a great seeming compromise candidate. Here's a guy who doesn't really belong to any of the major warring factions and maybe can stand between them and promise compromise. And that was what he ran on, was compromise and peace. But as soon as he got in, first of all, Donald Trump's ambassador, William Taylor, sabotaged a peace effort by the German foreign minister named Steinmeier to restart the peace process and get the Minsk II deal implemented, which was just treason against all humanity. And people ought to throw rotten fruit at that guy everywhere he goes for the rest of his life for this. But secondly, the Nazis held these massive rallies called the No to Capitulation rallies, where they threatened in no uncertain terms to shoot Zelensky dead in the head, to hang him from a tree on Kramatorsk Street or whatever. I can never pronounce it right. The main drag there in Kiev. He wouldn't dare sign a peace or we'll kill him. Because see, that would mean that all the boys who've died in the war already will have died in vain. Now, as long as we're still fighting, then that day never comes. But the day we lose, especially the day the president gets on his knees and surrenders, that's the day that he betrays all the boys who gave to the very end their best and last in devotion to the cause, right? So he says, okay, well, don't murder me. I'll just keep getting more of us killed then. And so he kept the war going and, helping to lead to this thing. And so it's really a shame because he could have played that role. Now he plays the role of like putting a Jewish face on a National Socialist regime, or at least a coming one. Again, I don't want to be too hyperbolic about the form of the government as it is now. I mean, they're under martial law. People go, well, he can't stand for election. Don't you know he's under martial law? Yeah, but he's the one who declared martial law. He could undeclare it and hold an election then. Abraham Lincoln stood for election in the middle of our Civil War. I'm sorry?
I want to say since 2014, they haven't done the whole country in an election.
That's right. In 2014. Yeah, even then, like,
well,
the East was in rebellion.
They haven't controlled the whole country since 2014.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
But that's kind of the point that I'm making is you don't really know what the majority is if you're not taking into account all of it. If you're seeding as Russia,
you would agree that the majority of Ukrainians are anti-Russian today after the invasion, I assume, right? I mean, it's more or less clear cut before.
It depends on who you count. You know what I mean?
That's kind of what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah. Now that Russia has, by taking out a black magic marker and redrawing the international border, has declared that everybody in Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson are all Russian citizens now, then I would say, yeah, you have left very few pro-Russian people inside Ukraine anymore.
So you think if we somehow magically were able to reliably poll everyone in the Ukraine, then it would still be split?
Sure. And look, if if Mexico invaded South Texas, might some Hispanics be like, oh, good, I'd rather be ruled by Mexico City than Austin? Maybe. Might many of them join with the Anglos to fight? Yes, because they'd rather be Texans. They're not Mexicans. They're, ethnically what we call Mexicans, but they're, Hispanics from Mexico, but they haven't been Mexican in 5 generations or 2 or 3 or 4. I mean, there are a hell of a lot of Hispanics in Texas who have no allegiance to Mexico whatsoever. They wouldn't even know what you're talking about if you brought that up. So just because someone is a pro, like Russian, loyal to the Russian Orthodox Church, speak the language, whatever, doesn't necessarily mean that they wanted to join Russia. And they may very well have rebelled against the idea of being invaded. And this goes back to, I mentioned Paul Manafort. One of his jobs, he's a political fixer. He's a real, if you're ever running for something, hire him. He'll get you one. He's an expert pollster. And he said he is so deeply familiar with the attitudes of the people of southern and eastern Ukraine. And they love Russia, sure, but they did not want to be ruled by Moscow. And, a lot of times in these places, people really identify themselves with their city rather than with their country, right? And so the Muscovites we love them and they're our brothers and everything, but their sovereignty stops at this line and we have our own problems here kind of thing. So I think maybe the pro-Russian side oversimplifies too much that anybody who's a Russian speaker must automatically want to be part of Russia. I think that was not the case. But it's sort of beside the point though, right? Because the point is that some ethnic Russians, in fact, many of them were being slaughtered. And the national government in Moscow's position was, enough of this is enough. Now we are going to go in and protect these people, whether they like it or not. They are going to be.
So how real so you don't see that as a pretext. You see that as genuine.
Well, look, let's stipulate that the pretext of every government is that they are a security force. I think that's actually legitimate in virtually no case, right? If you read Murray Rothbard's Anatomy of the state rulers are the criminal gang who won a monopoly on power and decided to tone it down a little bit and stay in place and continue to harvest all that tax money rather than just pillage and rape and run over the next hill. And so that's essentially who we're ruled by, is the most powerful criminal syndicate in any particular territory. So never mind the morality of it. This is descriptive, not normative. Moscow's business is protection. These people need protecting. We're going to protect them. You can read that like a New Jersey mobster's pronunciation of the whole thing, right? But it is what it is.
Understood. And so that leads me to my next question. I was wondering what you think about the way Russia's running the war in terms of the, crimes that they're accused of, like the Bucha massacre, what they did in the Mariupol siege, in terms of kidnapping Ukrainian children. Like, how do you think about the way they've conducted the war in terms of international humanitarian law and so on?
Well, I do have pretty severe treatments of all of those, more particular issues in the book. I think that, look, it's an invading army and they killed a lot of people. I think in the case of what happened in Bucha, a lot of that was embellished at the time because it was meant to thwart the peace talks. And it was, if people look deeply, I think the New York Times in-depth investigation of what took place there is very credible. I think they did a really good job on that. And I think it was a Frontline PBS as well did a thing. And I'm not like the first guy to recommend those. You could argue like, oh, that's against interest because this is like the American regime. But I'm saying if you look at their journalism, they did a pretty solid job on examining what happened there. Maybe some of the places they extrapolate their conclusions a little bit more than I would like. But I think what they show is not a genocide, is not a massacre where the Russians, tore through this town and killed everybody that they could find and all of this kind of thing, an act of genocide, as Zelensky said. That's not at all what happened. What happened was they were trying to get through these 2 kind of small suburbs north of Kiev to get to the outskirts of Kiev to threaten it. And one of the places where the civilians were killed the most was where the Russians apparently were in like some kind of holding pattern. They weren't ready to move yet, but it was one squad's job to keep this street clear. So if anybody comes down this street, you shoot them. Well, nobody had any warning. So you see this lady on a bicycle comes around the corner and then the tank just blows her away with a 50 caliber round or whatever, right? This kind of thing. And it happened to a lot of people who came around that street into what the Israelis would call a free fire zone. And you'll figure out where the line is when we blow your arm off. You know what I mean?
What you're describing is exactly how Israel has killed thousands of civilians.
So this is what they did. And they killed a couple of dozen this way on that one street there in southern Bucha. And then apparently some people were also rounded up and shot. The Russians said, well, they were essentially militia guys from territorial defense, quite possibly Nazis. But they were accused of being spies and then executed. Well, I don't know about that. Stay behind militiamen in their own town. I think they get a tribunal of some kind. I don't think you get to take them out and shoot them. So those were simply murders, if you ask me. But what they said was, oh my God, it's genocide. They killed thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And they built up all this hype. And I happen to remember because I was up to my eyeballs in it, or eyebrows in the thing at the time, on what was old Twitter, the liberal dominated old blue check Twitter, and the liberal Twitter swarm, as John Robb calls it. They took the Bucha thing and they ran with it, and they used it to essentially shout down any talk of negotiation before this war gets any worse, by saying you cannot deal with the Russians because look at how genocidal they are. When, of course, like, come on, man, are you really serious? You're saying these people are so ruthless that they will kill anybody in any town where they are, and that's why, to make sure to extend the length of the war, not to find a way to end it now. Because now it's just, you're supposed to dig in your heels in high moral dungeon and say these Ruskies, they're just so damn Russian, and look at how they are, and you would get all dirty if you negotiated with people like that. Oh, that's 3 years and 1 million dead bodies ago. Who's genocide now? Who's committed genocide now, if not the people who botched the peace effort with their ridiculous propaganda there? Same kind of thing at Mariupol. They said the Russians came in and they killed 20,000 people at Mariupol. And then it came down, it was like 7. And most of them died in the fighting. Okay. Yeah, in other words, there was a big battle for Mariupol. There was no like gigantic atrocity upon atrocity. That was just propaganda. And even the theater.
What about the charges that there was a siege that put the civilians at increased risk and
yeah, look, yes,
violated international law?
And I'm not excusing. I mean, there were civilians who were killed in the crossfire of the thing, but like realistically, they were collateral damage in fighting, in the same kind of way that you have in all of America's wars too, where they're ruthless about it. But just like when America's bombing Mosul or Raqqa, say in Iraq War III against ISIS, they're not deliberately trying to kill the civilians, but the civilians better get the hell out of the way. Unlike, say, for example, the Israelis, who are targeting the civilians in their tents, you know what I mean, and just going for it. Where here, look, the Russian way of war is ruthless. I mean, they essentially rain artillery on you until you move. I mean, that's it. They move slow and methodically and destroy everything in their path. And that way they don't leave anybody in the rear to snipe at their heels. And it's a hell of a way to fight. I mean, and it's been, you know, if you wanted to like summarize how the fighting has been on the Eastern Front this whole time there, it's essentially World War I plus drones. But you're talking about frozen, muddy trenches and rats and artillery and tank rounds and airdrop munitions as well. The Russians have found there's massive old warehouses of old Soviet dump bombs that they've now fixed fancy new guidance kits onto. So they call them glide bombs, and they can launch them from inside Russian airspace and just devastate Ukrainian lines with these, you know, up to 2,000-pound bombs, as opposed to artillery shells they've been fighting with and stuff. So it's just absolutely hell over there. And I prefer conservative numbers of casualties. Everybody overestimates the other side and plays down their own. I think have no solid basis for this. My overall sort of guesstimate is that both sides have lost about 500,000 killed and, you know, maybe 750,000 wounded on top of that, something like that. It could be less than that. Maybe it's 300,000 or 400,000, but killed, I mean, but it's a hell of a lot, and it's a lot of people maimed, and it's, you know, it's a devastating war, and it's been devastating for Ukrainian society. I mean, you mentioned the kidnappings, and that's basically a hoax. What they did was they said any Ukrainian refugees who fled east instead of west, they were all kidnapped by Russia. But that's not true. You're just like, it's like begging the question that if they were really refugees, they would have fled west. But why is that? It's not necessarily true at all. And then, as I show, like this guy won an award and all of this stuff for this thing about all the children being kidnapped. But journalists went and tracked that down, and he was just totally full of it. These kids, he said they were being held in camps like it was concentration camps. But then Jeremy Lafredo from the Gray Zone, he went and found them, and they weren't in camps. They were at camp. And they're sitting there playing the violin, getting violin lessons. And they're like, staying in a nice hotel and all this. Like they're not being persecuted and abused, separated from their families or anything like that, other than orphans from the war. So all of that was a bunch of hype. But the important kernel of truth in all of that is that Ukrainian society has been completely destroyed. I mean, this is a country of, was it 25 million people or something now? And they've probably lost 10 of those to being refugees, and most of whom have fled west, but some substantial portion of which have fled into Russia. And they already had a massive demographic crisis. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with this, but there was so much footage of old guys at the front, guys my age. I'm 49. See pictures of guys my age at the front, and people are saying, oh my God, they already ran out of young men, and now they have to send old guys to fight. But that wasn't true. That was people's mistaken presumption, was that Ukraine would have sent all their young guys to the front first, because that's what people do. 18-year-olds get drafted and go fight, right? But they were in such a demographic crisis. They were hoarding all their young men. They were sending all their 40 to 50-year-olds out to fight, 40 to 60-year-olds out to the front to fight. And they're keeping the young men in the rear so that hopefully they'd have enough time to reproduce before they went off to get killed. And it was believed that guys who are already in their 40s or 50s would have already had time to have a child. And so now they can be sacrificed. And then you'll see Lindsey Graham over there stomping his feet, demanding that they lower their conscription age from 27 to 25. And then he says, and 25 isn't low enough. How in the hell do you expect to win this war if you're not willing to send your 18-year-olds out to the front? And Ukrainian society is saying, we don't have enough 18-year-olds to keep having a society after this war if we send all our boys to the front. That is what a crisis we've got them in. I mean, this is really like, you're up against your worst bully in high school, and then I come up and push you into him. And now he's going to beat your ass, right? That's America treating our good friend Ukraine to a good ass whooping by the Russians when we have no attention or ability to do anything to protect them, right? We just got them in a fight that they're determined to be broken and in the hospital by the end of the damn.
To use the war party's argument, they're human shields, literally, for our foreign policy.
So regarding what we talked about before with the children, what do you think about the ICC case regarding the kidnapping of the children? Why is the ICC pursuing that?
It's total bullshit. Yeah, it's just politics. I addressed that in the book, and that was exactly what I was
talking about. Tell us about the politics. That's what I'm asking. Yeah.
I'm sorry I don't remember the guy's name off the top of my head. I have a section on this in the book. But the guy who came up with all this stuff was a professor from Yale, I think. And he's just totally BSing, right? He's like going off of just like not nearly enough information that he's extrapolating all these claims from, and then admitted that, well, no, I didn't check and make sure if it was true or not, and this kind of thing. So he was just wrong. And Jeremy Lafredo is the one from the Gray Zone who went there and found the kids in the camps, and they're not in camp. Again, they're at camp. It's just summer camp. And, and they're essentially fine. The whole thing was just a hoax. And the ICC, you know what? Take it for what it's worth. That's how political they are. And actually, I'm not sure if it was the ICC or was it the International Court of Justice, which those are different. Maybe it was both. But anyway, they're wrong. And if you go and check that part of my book, you'll see where when anybody went to verify these claims, there's nothing to them at all.
Well, it's just a warrant so far. There's no, that means the investigation hasn't happened yet. They just have probable cause as far as they're concerned.
But the warrant was based on the claims in this professor's study, which was lauded and he was awarded for and all these things. That became the basis of it all, but there is really nothing to it.
So we talked a lot about the American role. What's the EU's role in all this? Because if you talk to Ukrainians, to them joining the EU is very central, and the policy of the EU is very central. What was their role in all the lead up to this?
Well, the embassies of, I shouldn't probably cite them all off the top of my head right now without being sure. I know the Poles were definitely involved. But there were, the embassies of the prominent NATO capitals were involved in the Orange Revolution of 2004, as well as the Maidan Revolution of 2014 as well. And, they pushed hard. It was their deal that they essentially leaned on Yanukovych and forced him to sign, where he agreed to pull back his police forces from the Maidan, which was, of course, his fatal mistake and allowed for his own overthrow there. So, they could have, and I think that Putin probably would have been okay with this. He certainly has signaled more recently that he'd be willing to let Ukraine join the EU, but not NATO. And I think that they probably could have pursued that course. One of the problems is part of joining the EU is, and it even said in that association agreement, there's steps toward interoperability with the NATO military alliance in there as part of that. So although they could have negotiated that part of it, I think if they'd been more interested in joining the EU and made it clear that they were willing to absolutely forswear membership in the NATO alliance, they'd have been in a lot better position. But again, all this is taking place after Bush's declaration at Bucharest in 2008 that we definitely have them on the path to NATO membership now. So that's, definitely the poison pill built into European Union status. And now the problem is too that the EU states have been very reluctant. I mean, why are we even talking about this in the Obama years instead of in the W. Bush years or even the Clinton years, right? When they're expanding the EU then. And it's because of trade protectionism, right? Because the people of the poor former Soviet states in the East, all that labor would very much like to come west for higher wages. And then even the people staying are working for lower wages in the East so they can make finished goods at lower prices than German or French workers, right? Or other Western European workers. So the EU, and this was part of the reason, as I show in the book, this is part of the reason they expanded NATO out ahead of the EU, was because they wanted the full European integration. And they thought, well, if the Western European states are being trade protectionists and immigration protectionists here, let's just go ahead and expand the military alliance and the EU will catch up, which was stupid. They should not have done that. You know what I mean? But they ended up putting the military alliance before the political and economic integration. And then, so another part of this then is Russian protectionism, because if Ukraine had signed the association agreement with the EU in 2013, it would have been forced, even though the EU wasn't going to lower their tariffs on Ukrainian goods, Ukraine would be forced to lower their tariffs on other European finished goods, which now can come flooding across Ukraine's border into Russia and undermine Russian trade protectionism and their tariff policy on keeping European finished goods out in favor of Russian manufacturing. So that was one of the reasons why Ukrainian integration into the European Union economic system posed an economic threat to the Russians. And in the lead up to those negotiations, they started clamping down and doing more inspections at the border, as they called them, and this kind of thing, and making life more difficult for Ukrainians trying to trade across that border. So you know how countries can be when people are trying to knock their trade barriers down. We had gunboat diplomacy in our past, which said, you're going to let us trade with you or we'll kill you. And then they had to give in to only at gunpoint. You know what I mean? So you could see the Russians essentially were being put in the same position. And for that matter, Ukrainian industry in the Donbass was being put, which is kind of the industrial heart of Ukraine, was being put in that same position too, because this is the economic and industrial powerhouse of the country. But mostly it's decrepit, older Soviet era or post-Soviet era firms that are not really capable of keeping up with the EU. And so would have had much to lose. So even though Yanukovych, who represented the parties from the East, wanted to push for this, there were people in the East who had a lot to lose if he did go through with it. And so it makes it all much more complicated for everybody, I guess.
What's going on right now in the terms of the military balance? What's going to happen over the next year or two? It looks like Russia is making advances, but it's so slow. Are they going to be able to break through? You did mention you think Russia's going to win. Why do you think that? And what's it going to look like? And what's the balance on the battlefield right now?
Yeah, well, they're going to win because it's a bigger country with more men and more money and more weapons, and it's as simple as that. There is no great Ukrainian advantage here. If it was Western money or Western technology, we'd have seen the results of that by now. Western money and technology has certainly helped the Ukrainians hold the line as best as they can, and they're certainly much better off with it than without it, from their own point of view there. But ultimately, they're doomed. The reason the line is moving so slow is because the Russians and the Ukrainians both have adopted a strategy of attrition, where the focus is really on killing the other guy's guys more than moving and claiming new territory. Now, they are moving and claiming new territory, and there are, of course, strategic positions. This town has very important railways. This town overlooks the bluffs or whatever, right? Like some of these things are very important. But at the same time, they're essentially fighting a war of attrition on the idea that eventually the other side's lines will just break and they'll be able to go where they want and do what they want. The Ukrainians, by the way, say the same thing, that we don't even mind losing territory because, and you'll notice we're retreating slowly because we're grinding up Russians as we retreat, and we're killing so many Russians that one day their lines will break and we'll be able to push them around and go wherever we want and take back all of the East. So they both claim that that's their strategy, is taking territory secondarily to just keep fighting and keep, the other guys desperate. As we're recording this, the Russians, although it's in super slow motion, I mean, this has been going on for months now, they seem to be in the very last stages of taking the town of Pavlovsk, which is in the western Donetsk province. So they still have about a quarter of Donetsk to go. The Russians control virtually all of Luhansk, with very slight exceptions, but like 99% of Luhansk. But they still have about a quarter of Donetsk that they have not taken, and they still have about 1/3 of Zaporozhye and 1/3 of Kherson, which they have not taken yet. And they officially annexed those provinces in the fall of 2022, after the Ukrainians had one big success at Kharkiv and at Kherson. And Putin said, oh, yeah, well, I'm calling up 300,000 more men, and I hereby officially annex Zaporozhye and Kherson. So that's all of what's formerly known as Novorossiya, that is the Donbass and the entire Azov coast all the way to the Crimean Peninsula, and that so-called land bridge providing territorial continuity between the Crimean Peninsula and the Russian Federation. I don't think there's a thing that the Ukrainians can do to reverse that, and I don't really think that there's anything that the Europeans could do to reverse it without America to help them do it. I mean, whatever. I guess if the Germans and the Poles and the Baltic states all just poured their armored divisions in there, like, who knows? I don't know. I just don't think they've got the men or the armored power to do it. I think it would take the Americans unleashing everything they've got conventionally on Russian forces in the east to drive them out. And if we did that, it would be full-scale war between the Russian Federation and NATO, and probably the end of northern human civilization. So that's why Joe Biden wouldn't do it, and that's why Donald Trump won't do it. That's why, same thing for all the various prime ministers and chancellors and presidents of Europe. They're not going to do it because it would mean war with Russia. And so, back to what I was saying about how cynical this is. If you look at, and you could say the same thing about Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden was trying to replicate the Soviet war in Afghanistan, only with America in the Soviets' place, which worked. The Americans also thought, yeah, it would be great in the 1980s. It'd be great if if the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. See if we could provoke them into invading. We'll bog them down and bleed them to bankruptcy. Well, pardon me for being such a wimp and a lily-livered bleeding heart about this, but 1 million Afghans were killed by the Soviets in that. And America's Republicans and Democrats and Osama bin Ladenite terrorists all agreed that, oh, well, so what? God will sort them out. They're all in paradise now, right? If they were true believers, so fine. Except I don't think so, right? That's not my morality at all. That's absolutely horrific. And that's the same thing that they're doing here. That essentially the Ukrainians are just cannon fodder. They're like extras in our movie. And I have the whole, because see, I'm not that good of a writer. So I just really compile things in chronological order and stuff. And I just, you know what I mean? It's all kind of grouped together, maybe clumsily, but it just makes it all too clear. Here's my collection of quotes of prominent American officials. Oh, my hands aren't on the screen here. Here's my giant collection of quotes of the prominent American politicians and officials exclaiming that we're killing Russians on the cheap. We're sending them home in coffins. We're sending them home in body bags. Russians are dying. It's the best bang for our buck ever. So says Lindsey Graham. So says them all. And they will say repeatedly, Russian soldiers are dying and no Americans are dying. It's great. And they won't even mention the Ukrainians. And when I say they, I mean, I got 8 or 10 of these quotes. where the Ukrainians don't even get an honorable mention. They're like, well, they're making a great sacrifice for the greater good. They don't even get that. They don't even exist. They are only here to die at the Russians' expense. And meanwhile, whose society has spent $300 billion on this war? Ours, not Russia. It's America that spent $300 billion on this thing. We're the ones suffering the strategic defeat. We needed that money to pay interest on the national debt.
So, what do you think can be done from here, Scott? What do you think would probably be like if you possess Donald Trump tomorrow, or Putin, or Zelensky? Well, we could do all three if you'd
Yeah.
like. What do you think would be the correct move in each one of their situations?
Look, Zelensky needs to cut his losses. And if he's got to take a bullet for it, fine. A lot of dudes have died in this war. Get yourself some good security and then negotiate. For the Russians, they've got all of what they need. They've taken virtually all of the Donbass. They have guaranteed full land access to Crimea and including the freshwater resources from the Dnieper River, which the previous junta had shut off that canal access. But that's all open again. The Russians have plenty of ability to protect that land. That ought to be good enough. They don't need Kharkiv and Odessa. If anything, they should leave some Russians inside Ukraine, at least for now, see what happens. But they should call it off as soon as they can. And for Donald Trump, I think he's in a very tough position, dude. I think he's sincere. He wants to end this war, but he's just not in any position to. He was sworn in just right at a really crappy time to end a war where the Russians, as I was explaining, are not done winning yet, but the Ukrainians aren't done losing. So you're demanding that they turn around and walk away from territory where they're still standing? Now, there are a lot of deserters, but that doesn't count. The officer says, hold. Now, asking them to just turn around and walk away from the 1/4 of Donetsk they still control, right? It's like asking the Americans to go ahead and walk away from the Texas Panhandle while they still own it. You know what I mean? Like, dude, that's a lot to ask. They don't want to do that. And what can Trump offer to Putin that's going to make it worthwhile to him to call it short of his goals, which could be
NATO.
very costly for him politically? And when everybody knows that Donald Trump is the only person in all of Washington, D.C. who has any regard for Vladimir Putin whatsoever, and that if he drops dead of a McDonald's heart attack tomorrow or is replaced by Chelsea Clinton in 3 years, that we're going to go right back to the previous policy where they're going to regret compromising with him and stopping short of their final goals because they find themselves right back in conflict with the West again. So I think what it would take, like if I worked for Trump, I would tell him, you got to come up with a deal so big that Putin just absolutely cannot refuse it. And the Democrats and the CIA and the entire American political and military and national security establishment cannot undo it. So bring him to Washington.
I was thinking Russia entry into NATO might do certain things like that, because then you give
Well.
Article 5 protections all around.
Then we go to war with
No one
China.
could-
Yeah. Then we attack the Chinese.
Yeah, that's the downside.
Yeah. Okay. Not that big of a deal. But what about we get back in all the treaties? We get back in the anti-ballistic missile treaty. We get back in START 2, which the Russians had signed and George W. Bush never did, but should have after Clinton negotiated the thing. We save START 2. We extend New START. We get back in the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. We get back in the Open Skies Treaty, and we work on a brand new comprehensive thermonuclear weapons treaty where everybody can go home a winner, right? And then we do total lifting of sanctions, total reintegration of Russian politically with the European Union, reinvigorate the NATO-Russia Council. And then on top of that, and look, they're competitors of ours strategically overall. They are a resource exporting nation, as are we. So it might be difficult to find too much overlap, but in the past, at least, there were deals where you had like Shell Oil and was it Exxon? I think it was Exxon developing oil resources in Siberia. So I think if we can get American mining companies and American oil companies, hell, American timber companies in to do business inside Russia, then we can find ways to make money together and reintegrate our economies together and work together. I mean, after all, dude, like, we only live a few decades at a time and all of that, but you got to zoom out a little bit. Like, what are we going to do, dude? Is the earth ain't big enough for us and the Russians, or it's got to be, right? Like, we're going to have to deal with this civilization as we have for the past, millennia. It was Henry
Got to
Kissinger.
be early Dick Cheney. God didn't see fit to put all the oil under democracies.
That's right.
Not late Dick Cheney.
Exactly right. So like, figure it out, find a way. And look, to quote Joe Biden, no Russian leader has thrown in with the West like Vladimir Putin since Peter the Great. He has done everything he can. He has had the accommodationist foreign policy. Hawks to his right have criticized him for 25 years in a row now for trying to accommodate the West. And his answer has been, well, you say that if you want to, but what are you going to do? We're white and we're Christians and we're Europeans. He told Madeleine Albright, he goes, I like eating with chopsticks. It's fun and everything, but like, we're part of European civilization. Now, maybe they are the eastern frontier of European civilization, but they're not an Asiatic civilization. They are part of Christendom overall, broadly speaking. And they are determined. They're certainly their elite classes in Moscow and St. Petersburg consider themselves Europeans. They want to be part of this same civilization with us. We're insane to kick them out. And quite frankly, like, people they're so hurt about like, oh, you're criticizing America or whatever. But like, you really going to get all upset emotionally if I disapprove of decisions taken by Bill Clinton? The same guy who burned all the Branch Davidians' little babies to death. The same guy who savagely bit Juanita Broderick on the face as he raped her. And then I go, oh, you know what? That guy also made bad decisions concerning his Eastern European policy. And then you're going to be like, no way, that's my country you're talking about, dude. Or no, that's just Bill Clinton, the face-biting rapist, scumbag POS, who, of course, everything he did was wrong. Of course, everything he did was wrong. And remember, what was his successor again? Who was his successor again? Oh, George W. Bush, the cross-eyed, narrow-minded, short-sighted, cruel little shit, right? Despicable little idiot with an IQ of probably what, like 73, 74, who used to explode frogs with firecrackers like Beavis and Butthead when he was a teenager. Because he's a cruel, horrible, hateful, low IQ little idiot who, of course, everything that he did was wrong. Of course, everything that he said was a lie. And everyone that he killed was innocent. And while he let the guilty go free. And then I go, oh yeah, that was the same guy who overthrew the government of Georgia, the government of Ukraine, the government of Kyrgyzstan, sticking his thumb right in the eye of Vladimir Putin. Picking up where Bill Clinton left off, backing Chechen suicide bombers as long as they're disrupting pipeline routes through the Caucasus. These men are monsters. The fact that I'm from Texas
continue to do it
doesn't
after
mean-
Putin offered us friendship after 9/11 and tried to
That's
help
right.
us back us on the war on terror.
That's right. And Bush kept
Continued
backing
to
them.
back that.
Bush kept backing the terrorists after that for years after that. After they're blowing up, the terrorists are blowing up Beslan. Yeah.
Do you also think that Vladimir Putin is a monster in the same way? Because you get very passionate when you criticize these guys, and I happen to agree with you. But what do you think
Yeah,
about Putin? How does he compare to them morally?
Well, look, I don't feel that way about him because I'm not responsible for him, right? I'm not being falsely, other than like by the kooks, I'm not ever being like falsely implicated in their crimes, right? Or like what I'm so animated about is the idea that to explain all this stuff is to criticize my own country, when in fact, it's my national government's alibi that they name themselves the same name as my country is named. Oh, the United States of America, the place with 360 million of us, or however many it is now, from Bangor to Bangor, right? From Portland to Portland, from San Diego to Newark. No, that's whatever Bill Clinton does, whatever George Bush does. We are all responsible for that. And if I criticize it, then I somehow hate all the people and all the land and the country that I am part of, when obviously all I'm doing is attacking the war party and the things that they did. You know what I mean? As far as like Russia, I don't get this animated about Putin because I'm not Ukrainian and I'm not Russian, right? If he was doing this to my country, I'd be pissed off. Or if he was doing this with my country, I would be pissed off in the
No, I
same
wasn't
way
trying to
that I'm pissed
criticize
off
you. I was
about what.
wondering how you compare him morally to these American presidents. I understand why you're more passionate
Yeah.
about Americans.
Well, look,
Yeah.
I mean, I measure them simply by piles of skulls. So Bill Clinton killed probably 500,000 people. George Bush killed probably 2. Obama killed another 2. Putin's probably killed, or gotten killed 1,000,000 people, somewhere around there. So that
So
would
pretty
rank him,
same
morally
ballpark.
speaking,
Yeah.
right up there, right around a Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama type. I think Barack Obama's probably killed more. But yeah, no, look, and this has always been the case with Vladimir Putin. It's one of his actual attributes to his credit, in a sense, is that the guy is absolutely a cold-blooded psychopath, right? And the benefit of that is that he doesn't get upset. The Americans will sponsor suicide bombers blowing up school children in his country. And he will say, listen, I have to say I'm quite disappointed in some of the decision making by our American partners recently. And I hope that in the future we can move forward in a spirit of cooperation on counterterrorism. Like, dude, what? I'd have been threatening war, right? And he's like, listen, our American partners sometimes use their suicide bombers in ways that are imprudent. Like,
It's
wow,
business to
yeah,
him.
that's
It is. Yeah, it's
pretty good
business as
human
usual.
character there. You know what I mean? He could be a lot worse. So then the same guy then doesn't give a damn when he goes ahead and pulls the trigger and escalates a war to a major degree. Same guy. You know what I mean? But so that's what you get with that cold of blood.
What do you think about the argument that it's not equivalent because one side is protecting democracy and one side is
Nah,
fighting
that's
for
bullshit.
authoritarianism?
None of this has anything to do with democracy whatsoever. Democracy means you do what the Americans say. Right now, you have super majorities in America and all of Europe, every state in Europe, including the Baltic states and including Ukraine, want peace. Do our national governments give a good goddamn about that? Hell no. Democracy, nothing, dude. They don't give a damn about that. They'll rig any election.
So what's really motivating? What's the through line of American policy towards Russia since the end of the Cold War? What are the actual interests behind it?
Well, it's a conspiracy of interest. Overall, you have essentially, on one hand, it's hard to kind of rank them. I think if you want to give the devil his due, they think they're right. They think that if America's not the world government, then the whole world will tear itself apart in violent conflict. And so we have to do it. You even hear Donald Trump say, I picked up the phone. I stopped the war between India and Pakistan. I picked up the phone. I stopped the war between Cambodia and Thailand. I picked up the phone. I stopped the war in the Congo, whatever. And they all talk like that. They all believe that. They all believe that if there wasn't for NATO, then Hungary would be at war with Slovenia over the border, right? And that they all would always be at war all the time. And so America is holding the whole thing together. And then yeah, we make a lot of money while we do it. And we completely rig the game and we make sure our friend gets the contract and our friend builds the pipeline and our friend pumps the oil and our other friend sells the bombs and we get all these nice dividends. But surely nobody notices any of that. And nobody thinks that any of this is cynical or self-interested. We're only supporting democracy around the world. Now, of course, only in cases where the wrong guy won previously and we're trying to rig it so that our guy wins now, right? But of course, the whole world doesn't notice that. They only see that the Americans care so much that everyone has a bicameral legislature and a regular scheduled election process and whatever. When in fact, of course, every time they're putting their thumb on the scale and trying to rig the game. And that's because, as they put it in all their own doctrines, that they demand American global hegemony, political and military dominance by the middle part of North America over the entire rest of the planet Earth, to keep the peace. And that if any major power or even regional alliance of powers thinks that they can arm up enough to challenge us, and we'll kick their ass first, and we won't let it get that far. And that's the doctrine of the Defense Planning Guidance of 1992, the Wolfowitz Doctrine. And I mean, thankfully, they don't quite mean it because we'd have launched a preemptive war against China a long time ago now. Thank goodness they didn't really mean it. When push comes to shove, they back down. When they have to, just like they refuse to go to war with Russia, really, because they know that they can't. But that's their idea. It's sort of like with the Israelis, where they really don't know what they're going to do with Lebanon and Syria and Egypt and Jordan and Iraq and everybody, but they know that they would like them to be exploded and less powerful than they are now. And we'll figure out what to do about the next stage when we get to the next stage. And I think that's a part of this too, that they know that, for example, India is just too big of a country to ever be tyrannized and colonized and monopolized by a power like the United States ever again. I mean, the British went in there and really colonized the place and moved their people there and stuff. Like, we're just not doing that. India will be independent. Whose side are they going to be on? How well can we manipulate them and use them to help hem in the Chinese or whatever else? Like, those are all, small moves on a constrained kind of a board. They know that there's only so much that they can do with India. Same thing with Russia and China. They're independent nations. They've got nuclear weapons. So, there's a great speech, not great, but like insightful speech by George Friedman from Stratfor, which is sort of like the private CIA. They give briefings to corporate America and stuff. They do some dirty tricks, but they're mostly like just analysts and stuff. But he gave this speech where he talks about, look, the primordial fear of the Americans, and he could say, and the British going back 100 years, is an alliance between Germany and Russia. Because then you have all of Russia's materials with all of Germany's economic know-how and manpower and, industrial power combined. And if they were to combine in a real alliance, they could freeze Britain and America out of Eastern Europe, and then they would be the dominant power on the entire, what they call the world island, after the British imperialist Halford Mackinder said it's the world island. And here, America and Britain are naval powers. Well, Russia is the entire northern part of the world island. So if it's not us, it's them. And so we've got to stay in there. You'll hear John McCain misparaphrasing Henry Kissinger. It's actually Zbigniew Brzezinski who says that Russia, without the Crimean Peninsula and Ukraine, is a regional power. Russia with Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula is a global power, because now they have a 24 or 12-month warm water port and direct access to the Mediterranean Sea. And so that makes them no longer, hemmed in Northern Asia as they otherwise would be. And so it's, and I'm sorry, to continue with Friedman, he says, the American policy is that when Iran starts doing a little bit better, we hit them. And when Russia starts doing a little bit better, we hit them. When China does something, we hit them to keep them off balance, to keep them spending money, to keep them distracted, to keep them broken. We can't really take their ass over the way we wish. So we just make life hell for them as much as we can. And in fact, I'll end this little rant here with a real recommendation. I mean, it'll take half an hour of your time or something. You'll really get a kick out of it. It's called Extending Russia. And it was published by the Rand Corporation in 2019. So still during Trump years. And by extending Russia, what they mean is overextending Russia. And by overextending Russia, what they mean is provoking Russia into overextending itself. That's what it's all about. You know what we could do? We could harass them on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. You know what we could do? We could harass their access to the naval base at Kaliningrad. You know what we could do? We could stage another attempted coup in Belarus or in Kazakhstan. You know what we could do? We could pour weapons into Ukraine. Now, you got to be careful, because if you do that, you're driving up the cost for the Russians. But then again, they might get pissed and actually invade the country. And that would drive up the cost for Ukraine and for us, too. Better be careful. And then they say, oh, and you know what else we could do? We could pour more weapons back into the jihadi terrorists holed up in the Idlib province in Syria in order to cause the Russians and the Iranians and Assad more problems there. Of course, last time we did that, it blew up into the caliphate and we had to launch a whole war to destroy it again. So careful with that. And I really urge you to read it, because you totally see the mindset here of the mandate of these men is to write up this policy. What can we do to weaken the Russians here? But you can tell that the guys who wrote it really worried that you'll take their advice. And so they say in there, and by the way, if you're not familiar, the Rand Corporation is a official Pentagon-funded think tank, but it's out in California, so it can supposedly be independent, but it works directly for the Pentagon. And you can tell, because what they do is they make all these recommendations, and then they have disclaimer in big, bold, black letters, disclaimer, and then they say, don't do this. If you follow this advice, it could lead to these following terrible consequences. And then they say that over and over and over again. And they use the term, when they talk about pouring weapons into Ukraine, they say we have to carefully calibrate the amount of weapons that we put in there so that it's enough to deter Russia without provoking them into an invasion, which is the same thing that I quote from a piece in Yahoo News by a reporter named Zach Dorfman. And he quotes CIA officers right at the start of the war saying, "We told the bosses back home to tell the White House to knock it off. Stop sending weapons. We are not deterring the Russians. We're provoking them. The calibration is off." And then they just went ahead anyway. And that was the CIA officers on the ground saying that this is making the Russians feel like they have no choice but to go ahead and move now because it'll be easier now than if they have to do it later.
But also there was a limitation on the weapons that they were giving. What I felt at the time was that they weren't sending the kind of weapons Ukraine would actually need to defend themselves physically, but they were sending enough to alert the Russians that there's a problem and Ukraine is getting stronger. So it was a very bad policy.
I mean, even then, there was really nothing that America could give them that was going to make the difference. Right? We gave them our best.
Look at what they gave Saudi Arabia now, for example, right? They gave them all these F-35s, 300 tanks, something that they've never done with Ukraine. And I think the policy with Ukraine has been to go in enough to cause all the problems you're talking about, but not go in enough to use all of America's capabilities to fight Russia.
Yeah, counterpoint, though. 35 is a total piece of crap, falls right out of the sky. And the M1A1 Abrams battle tank, frontline battle tank, has been proven to be completely obsolete. The Russians can kill it with a drone that costs $1.75. There's one good benefit, ladies and gentlemen, of the war in Ukraine, is the Americans now know that our frontline battle tank is absolutely useless in a war against the Russian Federation. Okay, useless. So they can unload whatever crap they want on Mohammed bin Salman. It's the U.S. Army that fights Saudi's wars for them. They don't have to worry about that.
Do you think that the U.S. would have a lot of difficulty fighting Russia today? Let's move nuclear weapons out of the equation for a second.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the hard part, right? Because, of course, nuclear weapons would be introduced immediately and make the whole discussion moot. But yes,
theoretically, I mean, right? We don't actually know, but yeah, very, very likely.
Part of the problem is, you know, built into the question is we're talking about fighting them over there. Nobody thinks the Russians are coming here. We're talking about, can America field a big enough army in far Eastern Europe that the Russians,
along with its allies,
like, might they be able to hit our forces as they build up in Germany before they cross Poland to even get to Ukraine? Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, if we really were going to war in Ukraine, and it would immediately break out into a full-scale war with NATO and the Russian Federation. So even taking nukes off the board, at that point, you then have what we have not had in Russia, which is a full-scale mobilization and conscription campaign and a real-ass war. This is what they're now calling a special military operation, right? Like America's police action in Korea or Vietnam. That is not the same as when Stalin called up all fighting-age males and then some to go and crush the fascists. If the war were to spread, then that's what you would have, would be a full mobilization by Russia. And then I would expect them to do everything in their power to attempt to crush the Baltic states. And who knows what would happen after that. I think it would almost certainly devolve into a nuclear conflict. If it was just whatever, like, I don't know, think tank set piece battles between American and Russian conventional forces on the ground, I think America ultimately has the edge. We have more planes. We have a bigger Navy. And it may come down to the bombers, you know, conventional fighter bombers and long-range bombers. But then again, we're talking about if we were fighting the Russians in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Latvia, something like that. As far as like America actually like invading and conquering Russia, I don't think so, man. I don't know how they do it, and I don't know how they'd survive the winter. But like, yeah, actual regime change and like Napoleon attempting to go in there, hell no. You know, like overall set piece battle and somebody in some third country, yeah, I guess we'd probably walk away the winner. But in a real war, we'd all die. In a real war, none of that would be apropos. The whole thing would be atom bombs and then H bombs by dinner time.
So you said that the best solution, and I agree with you, would be to integrate Russia into sort of a network of institutions and agreements, arms control, and all that. How likely do you think it is that Putin would agree to that? To me, my concern with that is that geopolitically, he probably thinks that would be a good idea. But I wonder about his domestic political calculus, right? I always felt that the aggression that Putin shows, and I do feel that it's aggression, a lot of it comes in order to compensate for or distract from internal problems that he had. Like we look back at the Pussy Riot and those demonstrations of that
Yeah.
era, and he's completely squashed that. And I think that his foreign policy had a lot to do with that. A mechanism that's very familiar to me from Israel, where Netanyahu has managed to do something very similar.
Yeah.
Do you think that Putin would actually want to integrate into all this, or that he has an interest in keeping this
Yeah.
tension alive so that he has the West
No.
as sort of a scapegoat?
No. He always has sought to integrate with the West and has always shouted down, critics on his right, including the guy who replaced him for a couple of years there, Medvedev, in the early Obama years, has said, like, no, we need to just screw the Americans and the West. We need to move east and focus on trading with Asia and all that. And this has been a perennial fight, and Putin has always been on the pro-Western accommodation side through the worst kind of conflicts, including, again, right after the Beslan massacre and stuff. He calls us his American partners. He's determined to continue to do productive business with. The issues where we disagree, like them backing suicide bombers against our school children, well, those will just have to stay in their own little compartment, because we have other things that we are working together with America on in certain places, including killing bin Ladenites in other places, where that's what's up. That's what matters, and that's what we're prioritizing. And so I think that, no, he's been reasonable. I think the hardest part of it is that he's already been in power for 25 years, and that can't last. And whoever comes after him is probably going to be to the nationalist right of him, to our great regret. And I think also that even if it's just him, that there's a major problem with the fact that especially the Democrats, but really all of Washington, are so high on their own crack supply here about the way that they have demonized him in order to justify their own folly, that now it's just like they did with Saddam Hussein. Once they turn him into Adolf Hitler, now even after they smash his army into a million pieces, they still can't bring him back into the cold because he's Adolf Hitler. And so it's the same kind of thing they've done with Putin, where they've characterized him as so evil that now, again, like I say, Donald Trump, he'd have to bring him to Washington, take him to dinner, take him to the ball game, sign 10 treaties with him, write a song about him, and just announce to the American people, like, the new Cold War is canceled. America and Russia, we are friends. We're not treaty allies, but we are bros. So say we all, right? And like, that's it, in a way that makes it politically just impossible. And see, what I describe is politically impossible, right? For Trump to go that far to accomplish this is impossible. And then being that he would have to make it such a big deal that it'd be impossible to then crush and sabotage. So I think it's just, we're all in a real rock and a hard place situation there, right? Like, if anybody could do it, it would be Trump, because especially on this issue, if they want to criticize him, he can just tell them to go to hell, right? He don't want to hear no more about Russia. You don't like my Russia policy? Beat it. I don't give a damn, right? Like, he could do that. That's the one thing he's really got going for him here. But then, on the other hand, he's never read a book about it. He doesn't really know about it. He's got a feeling that it'd be better to, if we're going to switch from Eurasia to East Asia, it'd be better to go ahead and ally with Eurasia before we switch to East Asia, And like, it's not a deeply nuanced understanding. It's not the kind of thing where, like, he has a real vision for how the world's supposed to be with, America and Russia and all our European friends in the middle, and how we're supposed to proceed from here. All these intricate balance of power politics and stuff like that. He doesn't really know a whole lot about that. So I think his ability to kind of to forge a path towards a better way is probably going to be very difficult. You know what I mean? He's sort of a one-eyed man in the land of the blind.
But there is cause for optimism in America, right? I mean, the people you're talking about who designed this policy, they seem to be losing power between the rise of your AOCs and the rise of, or control of, Trump. And he's even being challenged by people saying he's not being isolationist enough, right? America only, America first, whatever you want to call it. The consensus, the Washington consensus, really, to me, looks very weak. It's almost amazing how much power they still wield. Where do you see that going in the future?
Yeah, good point. I mean, this is the great crack up, right? It's the people versus the power, right? You have the donors and the party leaders on both sides who have this sort of neoliberal, neocon consensus, the centrist sort of consensus. And then out here in the country, people are just in revolt. And it all comes down to the prices on the shelf, man. You can say whatever you want about any of these policies. Price inflation is a killer. And, just like with Joe Biden being too old to be the president, you don't have to know anything about anything, right? You could be like your next door neighbor's cousin's stepmom knows that Biden is too old to be the president, dude. Just look at him. If you've ever known any old people, he reminds you of one who is too old to be the president of the United States of America. Come on, man. You can't be serious. Well, it's the same thing with prices. Okay. You don't have to know nothing about political parties. You might think that the Democrats are the right wingers. You might not know nothing, but you know that you can't afford to buy orange juice for your kids. You know that that's a problem, right? You look at the price of eggs, the price of cereal, the price of just basic things to make your household run. And you're working as hard as ever and you can't make those ends meet. You know that that ain't fair. And if you're paying any attention at all, you get the idea pretty quick. That's somebody's fault. There's a reason why we're all so broke and what's supposedly the richest country in the history of the world, right? It's because our government has misspent all of our hard-earned wealth, real work, real money that we bust our backs for, that they squander. And so I think, you can just make all the promises in the world. You can dress it up as red, white, and blue as you want. But if I can't afford to feed my family, then I can't afford to feed my family, and something has to give. And if the last guy won't fix it, then the next guy will fix it. And if the next guy won't fix it, then we'll go on to the next one. But there's no loyalty to any strong man until he can deliver on bringing prices down, or at least bringing real wages up. But of course, that's a huge ask, right? For real wages to actually catch up with the price of inflation, first of all, they would be blamed for causing inflation, all the wage earners. They go, oh no, all this upward pressure on wages is causing inflation, when they're the last ones to get a cost of living increase, of course, which is the height of unfairness. But then the only, that wouldn't really bring down the prices overall. The prices on the shelf, they're not coming down until we have a massive crash. And that's, when we live in this phony economic system that we have with this inflationary money that we have, it's the absolute, just, the poison pill in our entire capitalist system. Never even mind the IRS. It's inflation, because it doesn't just cause the rising prices, but it causes all these distortions and what the Austrian school economists call malinvestments, where artificially low interest rates resulting from monetary expansion causes businessmen to make bad decisions, lots of them at the same time. And so now you could have prices go up and down in certain sectors for various reasons, right? Somebody comes up with a new invention, or a very cold frost hits the orange crop, or whatever it is, can cause all kinds of different things. But what causes all different businessmen across many different sectors to all take out bad long-term loans on uneconomical decisions for their businesses all at the same time, leading to all these bad loans having to be called in and massive economic contractions? The cause of that? Funny money. Government printing money and holding artificially low interest rates and distorting the economy. So then we have what we're going through right now, what seems like economic pain to you and to your audience because of all the rising prices. These are the good times. You just want to be one of the guys sitting on those rising prices and selling for higher prices now, not be a laborer whose wages are not keeping up with inflation. But the only solution to the pain of all these high prices then is a massive crash and a correction from the artificial boom that they've got us going through now. So then, now your prices maybe will stop going up. They're not really ever going to go back down, but maybe the rate of inflation will finally stop. But now you're unemployed. And so you can't afford anything anyway. And so this is how, when you have a fractional reserve economic system and an inflationary monetary system like we have, it means that the regular people get screwed coming and going. And at the same time, the mass of the population of this country can see that somehow we still have money for Ukraine, and we still have money for Israel. We still have money. Literally, when it was the craziest thing, when you had that storm, I'm sorry, I forget the name of it. You had that storm that went and parked itself over the mountains of North Carolina. It was a hurricane in the mountains. And so it just flooded all of these creeks and valleys and, these little creeks and valleys way up in the mountains in North Carolina. This is like the most unreasonable god dang weather event to happen. And just, I don't know how many people were killed. I don't think more than 1,000 people were killed. Hundreds are still missing. And this is like a year ago, right? Like in the summer of 24, wasn't it? When this happened. And the Democrats couldn't be bothered. The rich men north of Richmond, they didn't give a damn about what was happening in North Carolina at that time. And there were Black Hawk helicopters that were taking off from Fort Bragg, and they were flying over these desperate people who are going, oh, good, here come the helicopters. And then they fly and they keep going because they're on their way to back up Israel in their war against Iran, or like positioning for war against Iran. And they flew right over their people's heads. But the people in North Carolina, that was their money. Those are their helicopters. They're supposed to be rescuing them, taking care of them, not enforcing a world empire 7,000 miles away from here. And again, your cousin's stepmom's next door neighbor's little sister knows that ain't fair. You don't have to know anything about politics to know that isn't right. You have America first apparently means Israel instead. Okay, fine. America only then. Do I make myself clear? Let the Israelis murder kids on their own dime. We got people who are drowning in mud and no one is coming to save them. It ain't right. And everybody can feel it. And so, and the real problem, and this is the real danger, I think, is that people are moving to far left-wing and right-wing politics and economics, which are stupid and wrong and destructive. What's wrong with America now is not libertarian economics, it's neoliberal economics, i.e. corruption and imperialism, crony capitalism and inflation. That's what we have in the center. That's the neoliberal, neoconservative consensus that the American people are rebelling against. But they call it free market capitalism. So now
It's
people are moving
monopolies.
toward right-wing
It's
economic
monopolies. It's
nationalism
not
and
free
socialism.
competition. Yeah, that's what
Yeah.
people don't understand.
That's right. And so people are becoming, I saw a poll today that said 60-something% of Democrats say they support socialism. 60% say they support socialism. And on the right, people understand property rights and prices and markets a bit better in the first place, so it's not as bad. But they are becoming more and more protectionist and have less and less faith in freedom itself to provide. When it's actually is freedom is what makes everything work right. There's no central planning, there's no economic plan. People say they want the national government to take better control over the economy and make it more democratic or somehow and more fair for people. But look at the things where government intervenes the most, and you see how they completely destroy those markets. And that's most of all in medicine and in education. And you look how they just drive up the costs for everybody in everything. And they have no real ability to correct. You know, YouTube keeps serving this up for me. I clicked on it one time, I watched it, but I see it every once in a while on YouTube. They put it up. It's a documentary from 1970 about the disaster of the Great Society welfare programs. And it's Black women, leftist radicals with afros from, like, I don't know, New Jersey, I guess. And they're talking about how the do-gooder white liberal welfare people came and they literally paid these women to kick their husbands out of the homes. And they said what happened was, I think it's in Newark, New Jersey, maybe. And they're saying they really only had seasonal work in the summertime around there. And the rest of the year, there really wasn't much work. People were very poor. But in the summer, there'd be seasonal work and the men could get some jobs and whatever to try to make it through the year. Then the welfare people came and said, look, we'll pay you if you're a single mother. If you have a man in the house, you can't get the money. So the men made a conscious decision that this is the best thing for my family, is for me to leave them so that the government will buy them cheese and bread and milk to eat that I can't afford to provide. And so in a season, the men of this community all up and left. And here it's a year later, 2 years later, they're destroyed. They're destroyed. And the Black women, these are not right-wing Rush Limbaugh golf cart drivers. These are poor Black women from the hood, are saying they meant well. They came in to try to help us, but they created this, they didn't use the word, but this moral hazard. They ruined everything. That they created a disincentive for proper behavior. And they drove all the men away. And they said, so please stop so our men will come back. Well, guess what? They never stopped. That was 60 years ago, 55. And they never stopped paying women to be single mothers. Not for being single mothers, to be single mothers. Because it's the same thing. That's how it works. And they have no feedback mechanism that forces them to correct. If they're going to stop it, they'd have to admit they were wrong. And of course, if they stop it, they're literally cutting off payments to poor black mothers, some of whom are going to complain, right? Even though they've actually been forced into this perverse system, some of them are now going to be much worse off than before. First, you ran off my husband. Now you cut off my aid and screw me both ways, right? So they get themselves in that type situation. This is the idea that you would put people like that in charge of the economy overall to set prices on rents and on whatever, cars, on interest rates, on anything. It's nuts that anyone would think that you should have commissars of prices of human economic behavior. It's just, especially after all this time and how disproven it's all been. It's really a shame. And it's quite frankly, it's a danger to this country. You know, without freedom, we will have no prosperity. And without prosperity, then what do we got other than a war of all against all?
But ultimately, if all this inequality continues, that's going to be the direction. Because like you said, the instinct people have, if there's unequal distribution, make it more equal. That's what's going to happen.
Yep.
There's
Emphasis
really
on
no
make,
other way.
right? And then, yeah, we're all equally impoverished and equally hungry. That's how it'll end up.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
go ahead, Daniel.
I was saying between this and between this and the way that everything seems to be lining up geopolitically from the like we've said with Ukraine, and then you look at what's going on in Gaza, and the influence that you see from these wealthy financiers. It's like you have World War II resetting itself up. You see like all of the narratives being set up for the Nazis re-rising again, and all of the narratives for the rise of the communists again as well.
Yeah.
And that to me is probably the greatest worry between that and obviously more short term, this blowing up into a nuclear war. But like that to me, I just kind of see all of for lack of a better word, geopolitical landscape kind of aligning in that direction.
Yep. And it's such a shame. It just didn't have to be this way at all. And I guess this is why I write these books and I tell these stories, because I think I was very interested. I was in 9th grade during Iraq War I, when Bush is announcing the New World Order and says he doesn't need a congressional declaration of war. He has a UN resolution. And this is going to be essentially setting the table for how the 21st century is going to be. We're going to spend the last decade through the 1990s setting everything up for making everything the way we want it to be in the new century. And yet, and whatever. So I was interested in watching how all this would play out, how they're going to set it up, then how's it going to be after the year 2000 and all these things. And I just seen it all plays out to me like just the slowest motion train wreck, right? It's just, I mean, imagine a train with Bill Clinton as the engineer, right? Like that thing is going off a cliff, dude. It was just, we've had the stewards of American power over in the post-Cold War era have essentially all been Joe Biden, right? That's what we had. Joe Biden, he didn't lose the election, the primaries of 1987, 88. He won in 88. He's been the president since 1989. And that's what we've had this whole time. Joe Biden and Vice President John McCain. That's who we've had this whole time. This is the policies, essentially, Clinton and Bush and whatever, they've all essentially been interchangeable for that exact kind of centrist extremist consensus of what they've done. And they're just, I mean, to me, Biden and McCain, even more than the Clintons and the Bushes, Biden and McCain to me are like the perfect avatars of the American empire, right? These doddering old absolute idiots who in their prime, they never knew anything, right? And yet they know that they're right. And they always have violent conflict as a solution to whatever problem they disunderstand. And they, and they're always in a hurry. They never have time to actually sit and figure out a damn thing, but they're always certain and always wrong.
Do you think this was a continuation of the Cold War policy gone awry that worked during the Cold War, or do the mistakes go back to Truman and Eisenhower? Because Truman and Eisenhower aren't that different from McCain and Biden.
Yeah. Look, I mean, the problem is I don't specialize enough in that, but I am very skeptical of the original Cold War. My friend Gareth Porter's writing a book about that now, about how it was really a self-interested program by the Pentagon to keep their spending up by pretending the Soviet Union was 10 feet tall. I mean, I will give them credit that the Soviet Union was an evil, commie, totalitarian empire. They did rule all of Eastern Europe. And now I think by the end of World War II, they really were not bent on world revolution. Then again, they'd take advantage where they could, and they'd support commies around the world where they could, and that kind of thing. So there was, unlike bin Laden's Islamo-fascist caliphate, at least the USSR was a place, You know what I mean? You got to give them that. And they were in an alliance with Mao's China. So it wasn't nothing, but was it necessary for America to build a world empire to contain them? No, not really, I don't think. And in fact, if you look at what really finally killed the USSR, as we've discussed today, it was when after Vietnam, they gave up on containment. The American people didn't want to do it anymore. And they said, you know what? What if we baited the Russians into overexpansion? What if we encouraged them? Now, we don't want them to roll into West Berlin, but what if we encourage them to invade Afghanistan? Spend a few tens of billions of dollars trying to pacify those wild men. That'd be funny. And they encouraged them to intervene also in Latin America and in Africa and other places to help and bankrupt them. Once they gave up on the containment policy, the Soviet Union lasted about 10, 15 more years, and that was it. So maybe containing them was actually propping them up that whole time, by preventing them from making dumber choices and expanding their responsibilities further than they could afford to do.
So let's finish this up by tying this back into what's happening right now in Ukraine. So I'm just looking right now at the headlines, and there's there's a new American plan which is being described by Western media as a capitulation to Putin.
Yeah. We'll see
Yeah.
where it goes. I saw that headline that Witkoff is working on it.
Well,
I'm very pessimistic.
The Guardian has some leaks about it. So they're saying there's going to be everything under Russian control will be ceded, possibly a bit more. Ukraine would be forced to drastically reduce the size of its military, reportedly by half. The plan would give Russia new powers to control and oversee aspects of Ukraine's military and political sovereignty, which could mean Russian influence over Ukrainian defense policy, and it would limit military assistance to Ukraine from the West. And of course, end the war right now. And they're saying it's inspired by Trump's Gaza plan. So what are your first thoughts about that?
Sounds like a very difficult road to hoe, man. Again, the Ukrainians do not want to turn around and walk off the territory where they are. And look, unlike in Afghanistan, where as soon as America pulled support for the regime in Kabul, the thing had just evaporated. It was nothing but a house of cards. I mean, that's not the case with the regime in Kiev and its military. So if America called off all support immediately, they could still keep fighting for a while. I mean, I think they're probably pretty dependent on our intelligence support and the rest, but they could keep fighting for a while. So I think America may not be in a position to tell them, deal, damn it. I said deal. You're going to have to accept this. I'm reading you the riot act, sign on the dotted line, whatever. And especially because I never recommended this. I don't know where Trump got the idea that from the moment he comes into power, he ought to completely trash Zelensky as this scum, when what he needed to do was really show a united front toward Putin, that me and Zelensky get along okay, and I might not mind backing him, actually, and whatever, what kind of thing, to play that dynamic, the art of the deal. He didn't do that.
Exactly.
He made it clear that, like, you're scum, dude. I don't give a damn about you, which means that Zelensky's in the position. He's already kind of made peace with the idea that at some point Trump's going to walk away and that he's going to have to go ahead and make these decisions on his own anyway. So Trump, I think, sacrificed a lot of his sway with Zelensky by treating him that way when he came in. He had no real cause.
That was one of the worst moments of diplomacy I've ever seen, that scene in between them.
Well, and even before that, I mean, yeah, first of all, they should have rehearsed that whole scene before they were on camera about what's going to happen out there. But that was a few months into the thing. I mean, even from the time he came in, he was just trashing the guy in a way that he deserves, but was just idiot diplomacy, right? And it totally undermined Trump's ability to use Ukraine as leverage against Russia in any way. That, like, look, man, do what I say, or I could do this or that, whatever, when he already made it clear he doesn't give a damn what happens to the Ukrainians in this thing and whatever. So makes it very difficult. I think, I appreciate that he's got this guy Witkoff in there and that Witkoff is doing everything he can to try to end the thing. But I think, like I say, the Russians are winning slowly. Trump doesn't really have any sticks, only carrots, and his carrots are probably not big enough or believable enough to really be persuasive. So I'd be very pleased to be wrong about
peace here on this podcast. All right, this has been delightful, Scott. Really, I learned a hell of a lot. Yeah,
great, thanks.
What book of yours should we read to be introduced to your work? Those of us who haven't read any.
Yes, sir. Well, let's see. Oh, there it is, right behind me. There's. Oh, I always do this wrong. How Washington started the new Cold War with Russia and the catastrophe in Ukraine, and it's on sale.
My first was Enough Already.
Yeah, Enough Already is my book on the terror wars and the Middle East wars. Before that was Fool's Errand about Afghanistan. Provoked. It's a monster. It's a 7 by 10 and 10-point font and 700 pages. It's about a 1,000-page book if it was a regular size book. But about a third of it is footnotes because the way I wrote it, I consider the burden of proof is on me. If everybody's wrong except me, then I better prove where they admitted it. So that's all in there for you. And I take you all the way through from H.W. Bush all the way through the war and everything up through a year ago. And I really did everything I could to, like, as I said in a lot of your very good questions here today, I actually have a section on that. I have attempted to address so many of these things. If you'd ask me, yeah, but what about that time Russia tried to overthrow the government of Montenegro in 2016? Well, that's not really true, but I have a section on that, debunking that in the book for you too. It's all in there. I made sure, because I was really afraid, like, people were going to call me out for skipping something. So I skipped nothing. It's all there. And on top of that,
They showed in your answers.
yeah, there you go. So yeah, you could tell I put a lot of work into the book. And then I have a new project called the Scott Horton Academy of Foreign Policy and Freedom, where it's essentially long form video courses by myself and other experts. And my first course is already out. It's about 30 hours on the Middle East wars. My course on the new Cold War with Russia and the war in Ukraine, based on Provoked, is going to be much longer than that, more like 60 or 70 hours long. And that should be finally done, I think, in December. But so for people who want, as Tom Woods calls it, Scott Horton slowed down, and the real in-depth study of all of this stuff, that's all scotthortonacademy.com.
Fantastic. We'll have a link for that. Thank you so much for coming on. I hope we'll have the honor of
thank
having you
you.
on again.
And I also appreciate you coming here and on Breaking Points and spreading the anarcho-capitalist cooties.
Right. Thanks, man. And thank you both. It's been great to be here with you guys tonight.
Thanks, Scott. Have a wonderful evening.
Definitely. Anytime.
Thanks, guys.